Welcome to the Adoption and Foster Care Journey, a podcast to encourage, educate, and equip you to care for children and youth through adoption, foster, and kinship care. Hosted by an adoptive mom with over 22 years of kinship and adoptive parenting experience. She's on this journey with you. Please welcome Sandra Flack.
The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners. That is Isaiah 61, verse 1. Welcome to the Adoption and Foster Care Journey. This is Sandra Flack, your host. And it is my great honor to encourage and equip you for your parenting journey. I'm an adoptive parent like you, with over 26 years of lived experience. So I'm in the trenches with you, celebrating the highs, the lows, right? The good, the bad, the ugly sometimes. My husband and I have raised 5 children through kinship and international adoption. And they're all adults, young adults, 19 to 35 at this point. And our youngest 2, 19 and 21-year-olds, are also diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. So I get it, and I'm on this journey with you, and I want this podcast to be a resource for you, a source of encouragement and equipping and some inspiration along the way, something that I didn't have in those early days of my journey. And I hope that this show will be that for you. And I want to invite you over too, if you're liking what you hear, maybe you already follow us on social media, but if you don't, or even if you've been with us for a while, we started some new social media pages. We sort of are starting to transition the socials for our resources for adoption and foster parents over to our own pages. So they've previously been under Justice for Orphans, and now we have started 2 new pages, the Adoption and Foster Care Journey. We have a new Instagram page, which I believe is like AFC_journey. And the Facebook page is just the Adoption and Foster Care Journey. So you'll find us there, and I hope that you will go over and follow those pages and engage with us there. I look forward to interacting and connecting with you there as well. So now today, we are continuing our National Foster Care Awareness Month episodes with our guest today, Bethany Hall. Bethany is a licensed family nurse practitioner specializing in complex developmental trauma. She has lived experience as a missionary and a foster and adoptive mom, as well as extensive experience training nonprofit organizations, foster and adoptive families, educators, social workers, and others. She's been married to her husband, Kevin, for 17 years, and they have 3 children at home, both biological and adopted. Bethany is also a Tia to many young adults who are starting their own families. She is currently the Director of Training and Content at Chosen, an organization that exists to help children, youth, and families prevent and heal trauma through healthy relational connection. Bethany is passionate about providing trauma-responsive content and trainings that equip caregivers to be critical agents of change in their child's healing. So please welcome Bethany Hall. Hey, Bethany, welcome to the show.
Hi. So thanks. I'm so excited. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to get to know you. I know we haven't had the privilege of meeting in person. I'm sure we will at some events in the fall. There's lots of conferences then. You go to CAFO?
Yes, I'll be there.
I'll be there as well. We'll have to make sure we connect there. And but I'm excited to get to know you now, and for our listeners to be able to do that as well. And I'm curious to hear, because I know that you specialize in complex developmental trauma. You're also a foster and adoptive mom. So, like, what came first?
Yeah, so we actually, it kind of all came at a similar time. It kind of overlays. We struggled with infertility for a period of time, and I actually, even before that, I'd always desired to grow our family through adoption. And so when we'd been struggling with infertility for about a year and a half, we decided to start the adoption process and found an agency and went through all the process and then found out we were pregnant. And so we had my first son, our biological son. And then as soon as he was a little bit older, we started the process again to adopt and ended up adopting through domestic infant adoption and have a very open adoption with my daughter's family. And then we ended up going to the mission field. We served with back-to-back ministries in Monterrey, Mexico for almost 4 years. And they're kind of ended up having a bunch of adult kids join our lives after the age of 18 as we worked with their aging out population. And so I have adult kiddos that live in Mexico. I actually just got to go see a bunch of them over the weekend. And then we have another biological son, our caboose. So we've got kind of my big kids and then my little kids that are at home. But during that time, I think it really started growing in my heart when we were missionaries. So my daughter was still really young at the time. I wasn't seeing a lot of the effects of intrauterine trauma that I see now in her. But we were navigating open adoption, so I was interested in adoption and interested in foster care. But really, when we were serving on the mission field and growing in relationship with these kiddos that have had years and years of significant trauma and institutionalization, and we were giving them so much as an organization, I felt, and they were still often really struggling. And so back to back at that time was also kind of in this process of understanding, we're giving them things in all these areas. We're helping them get an education and we're providing stability and food and all these things, but they're still struggling. And so through that time, we went on that journey alongside of them of like, why? How does trauma really impact the brain? Growing in our understanding, growing in what these kiddos needed. And so kind of like what you shared with me about your journey, just started trying to get my hands on anything I could. So I had a background in medicine as a family nurse practitioner. I had an understanding of child development, but I just started reading anything I could on how trauma impacts neurodevelopment across the lifespan, and then seeing it in real life with my adult kiddos, and really just trying to figure out how to form attachment with a kiddo that's maybe now an adult, and some of those things. So I really just kind of went on my own journey, and that at the time, everything was kind of piecemeal. It wasn't like you could go get your master's in complex developmental trauma. It was just really seeking it out and trying to find anything I could on it. So that's kind of where our journey started, was both from a personal standpoint and in the work that we were doing as missionaries, trying to just do that to the glory of God as best as we could.
Yeah, I love that. I love the folks I know Beth, I've heard Beth
Yeah.
Guckenberg speak. So the folks at back-to-back ministries
Yes.
and love how they've really applied the trauma piece to what they're doing. Because I know, I know of churches who will do, ministry
Hmm.
and I know of one church that they've partnered with an orphanage that was being built and established in Mexico. And whenever I would hear announcements about that, I would sort of kind of do that cringe, like,
Yeah.
like, okay, but is the staff trained in trauma? Like, do they
Yeah.
understand all of these things? Because
Yeah.
that's, we have big hearts and we want to help, but if we don't know really what's really needed, it's not just, we know that little saying, love is not enough, right? There's
Yes.
more going on there. So I feel like back to back really sort of spearheaded that
Yeah.
movement of understanding trauma and learning and teaching and all of that. So I really, really appreciate that. So kids at home now, who's home? How old are your kiddos at home?
They're all about to have birthdays. I have one that's about to turn 14, one that's about to turn 12, and one that's about to turn 8. So those are my three little ones in the house.
Wow. So as you're parenting, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, but and I know you said your daughter was adopted.
Hmm.
Um, with that, as you've like living with it, right? Living with a child who's experienced the trauma and prenatal trauma as well, it's different, right, than just having clients and that kind of thing. So, what's been one of your biggest takeaways as just being a mom of a kiddo who has trauma?
Something that I teach on and that I live out daily, I say God, I think, called me to teach to keep me honest, because it is so hard. And so you can know all the things, and it just, we need the Lord and the Holy Spirit to convict us and to help us have the strength to go on. And I think the one takeaway for me is that it's just, no matter how much you know, No matter how much you understand that it's not your child's fault, no matter how much you understand there's limitations to what they can and can't do, it still is hard on our own nervous system and our own hearts.
Oh yeah.
And so I think just always growing in compassion of what people are experiencing. And, it's really just given me this perspective of I really see everybody's behavior through like what's going on with them versus I think probably before parenting from this standpoint, I might have taken things more personally or, been quicker to judge. And parenting a child with such challenges, I think has just really put me in a position of like, Lord, I don't know their story. I don't know what they're going through, and taking things less personally and really just trying to meet people where they're at, I think has been the biggest takeaway for me living with a child with a heart history.
Yeah. It's hard because I know as a parent, I help other parents as well, like you do. And then the school calls,
Yeah.
right? And then I'm like freaking out because the school called and sometimes I have to talk myself down and think, okay, what would I tell another mom? Right.
Exactly right.
But when it's our kiddo and it's us, and it's like some of that stuff sort of I forget all of a sudden,
Yes.
I lose it all because
Yes.
I'm the mom. So that's always a challenging piece for sure.
Yes, for sure.
So specializing in complex developmental trauma to help older kids and families. Tell us a little bit more about that work that you do.
Yeah. So my life, the Lord, it's a really great God story. I worked as a family nurse practitioner in pediatric emergency medicine for over 12 years. And during COVID, I was laid off. Weirdly enough, not everybody knows, but during COVID, pediatric emergency department numbers fell to almost nothing. People were afraid to come to the emergency department. And so, because we'd been in Mexico and I'd come back to my job, I'd lost some seniority and I ended up being laid off. And so it was one of the most devastating, probably top 5 most devastating things that ever to happen in my life. Walked in one day and just didn't have a job. And at the time, my husband was in school. I was carrying all of our benefits and the majority of what our family needed financially. And so I was like, Lord, I don't know what you're doing here, but this is not anything I would have chosen. I didn't see it coming. Thankfully, during that time in COVID, we did get some government assistance because of it being related to COVID. And so during that time, I just tried to live with open hands of like, okay, Lord, what do you want us to do while I'm trying to figure out what our next step is? And I was getting asked at that time to do some speaking and coaching for families. They knew that I had both personal and lived experience, and I just started kind of doing that. And that's how I connected with Chosen. And they just said, you're trying to market yourself, and we have a line out the door of people waiting for your service, your type of services. Why don't you join us? And so I started with Chosen, based in Texas, but we're a national organization. And so I started just doing one-on-one parent coaching, which is still the majority of our model even today, where we work with families that are significantly in crisis, feeling like they just can't go on anymore, like they can't stay together. And I started doing parent coaching. And then from there, we just wanted to move upstream. We wanted to start getting to families before they were in such crisis points. And we wanted to start creating resources for the things that we wanted to be able to share that didn't exist. And so when I would parent coach and families would be having a specific challenge and I'd go to look for resources, if there was a gap, I just started creating and trying to pull from, the word of God. Obviously, all truth comes from there. And then from best in the literature that was out there and putting them together. So often we lack something that's actually science-based, but through a biblical worldview. And so I felt like God had specifically gifted me to kind of consume the best of the science world, but then filter it through a biblical worldview and share that with families. And so very quickly, I became the director of training and content. And now my role is really just to do just that, is to consume what's out there as best as I can, and then make it something that's digestible and through a biblical worldview for families that are hurting and where there's gaps in those resources.
Sandra Flack, host of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast, and FASD educator Debbie Raymond, invite you to join Hope for the FASD Journey, a virtual support community for parents and caregivers raising individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, diagnosed or not. This faith-based support community meets online 3 times each month, features special VIP guests, and a private Facebook group for members only, which includes Soul Care Saturday video devotionals led by Sandra and Deb. Both Sandra and Deb are adoptive moms raising kids with FASD and facilitators of the Facets neurobehavioral model. For details and to register, visit justicefororphansny.org/hope- community. That's justicefororphansny.org/hope-community.
I love that. So, Bethany, just tell us a little bit about Chosen. In addition to the training that you do, what other things does Chosen offer?
Yeah, so Chosen, the majority of what we do is we have a whole staff of people that do parent coaching. And so families get matched with funding sources. We have multiple funding source partners, particularly for faith-based families that we can match them with. And they are able to come and get weekly coaching, typically for 4 to 6 months. And it's all through a trauma-informed lens. Most of our staff that work with families are TBR practitioners, have significant lived and professional experience, and just really say, so what happened this week? And all the things that we talked about, in your head, how did it go? Were you able to put it into practice? What worked? What didn't? Karen Purvis used to say, it's like throwing spaghetti against a wall and seeing what sticks. And that's really what they do each week, is say, what's working well, what's not working well. And also a big part of what we do is provide that co-regulation for the parent, right? So like you and I talked about, you can know all the things, but if your child was screaming at you and cussing at you and put a hole in your wall that week, you need somebody to say, that really stinks. That is super hard. And let's just take a second to take a breath about that and to acknowledge your fears around how it's impacting your other kids or your marriage, and just provide that co-regulation for parents. And so they do that week in and week out with struggling families. And that parent coaching aspect is a huge part of what Chosen does. And then we do, national trainings. I have the privilege of being able to do workshops and speaking nationally, and on kind of a Zoom format. We do those trainings. We have one coming up on big behaviors and kind of taking that brain-based lens approach to seeing the meaning behind the behaviors that really plague families. And so we're always trying to come up with those kind of trainings and ways that we can make it digestible for families, and in the privacy of your own home to be able to take some of those and learn.
And I love that. And I want to dive into that a little bit. But first, so for Chosen is in a lot of these, the coaching and all that, that's on an online platform.
Mhm.
So is it open to any foster and adoptive parent across the country, or is it sort of like regionally
Nope,
based?
that's the wonderful thing about our model is it's all telehealth. So especially for families who may be in really resource desert kind of areas where they can't necessarily get in-person therapy as a family or things like that, this parent coaching is available to really anybody that has a Wi-Fi connection.
I love that. And what's the website where our listeners can go to find
Yeah,
out more
if you
about
go to
that?
www.chosen.care, that's the main website. And from there, you can go to the services page or to our training page, depending on what kind of thing you're looking for.
Wonderful. So www.chosen.care. We will
Yep.
put link in the show notes so that our listeners can find that easily, because I love the fact that anybody who's listening can go to the website and get some help if that's what you're looking for. That is perfect. So I wanted to ask you about the training that you mentioned, the give us the name again. It's parenting through the big behaviors through that
Big behaviors.
based
Yep. A
lens. Yeah.
brain-based, it's big behaviors, a brain-based approach. And so really that one is looking at the topic of executive function, which that may be a new word for some people. I didn't learn about that until a few years ago, but it really is just how trauma rewires the brain and causes our kids to really engage with the world very differently than many of us do. And so some of the most frustrating behaviors cause our kids to really get some pretty bad labels, like lazy and selfish, and things that we think really are willful or are character flaws often are related back to some of the ways that their brains are rewired due to that trauma. And so it really looks at, what are the skills that are actually lacking when we break down these frustrating behaviors? Where might there actually be skill gaps that we can lean in? And one of my favorite quotes is, and I don't even know who said it, but it was that, we can never punish or shame somebody into learning skills. And that's just a reality I found to be true. We can punish or shame a kiddo into kind of some behavior modification, maybe, but so often that behavior cycles back around because they don't know what to do otherwise. They don't have the skill or the tool that they need. And that only comes through connection and time, and learning where is the gap that I can lean in there. So, really just looking at what are these behaviors, and oftentimes what is the skill that's lacking there, and how do we help build that skill?
Yeah, I talk a lot about executive function myself. I've heard it called, I think it was, I knew a doctor, Jared Brown, who's been a frequent guest on our show, and he calls it the boss of the brain,
Yeah.
right? And executive function, those deficits, really, that's a primary symptom of, say, fetal alcohol spectrum
Hmm.
disorder. And
Hmm.
like you, I didn't used to know exactly what all executive function, what it all entailed, but then just learning it that controls your impulsivity. It can, or your
Mm-hmm.
impulses. It controls short-term memory and
Mm-hmm.
planning and organizing and focusing and attention and goal setting and all of these technical things that if there's a lack there, then it does look like willful disobedience and defiance and all of these things. And parents really struggle with those particular behaviors,
Mm-hmm.
not understanding that that's really comes from a brain that works differently. And like you said, a consequence or a punishment or a discipline is not going to fix that. They
Mm-hmm.
really, it's setting those new neural pathways. It's repetition over time, maybe 1,000 times before they get
Yep.
it. They get it if it's a brain thing, right? So I
Yeah.
love the fact that you're looking at that. In the workshop, do you share or what are some of the symptoms of poor executive function that you talk about in the workshop?
Kind of some of the things that you already alluded to, but the things that really frustrate parents. So like we talk a little bit about how, following multi-step commands. A lot of people are like, I don't get why my kid can't just get ready in the morning and get out the door. And when we break it down, it's like, well, it's actually about 6 different steps that have to happen that at any point they can get derailed or distracted, right? So we talk a little bit about that, a lot about impulse control. So, a lot of us think things that we shouldn't say out loud, but thankfully, the Lord gave us impulse control, or want to punch the kid next to us, but don't do it because we know that there's going to be consequences. And so when a kid struggles with impulse control, oftentimes, they get labeled as they're really selfish. Well, that actually might be fixed thinking, which is in the brain to be able to have a flexible way to think about things. And so where it seems like they just never want to let anyone take a turn but them, or it always has to be their way, or, they can't ever handle a no, a lot of that goes back to a struggling with flexible thinking or a struggling with impulse control because I'm frustrated and I just burst into frustration kind of activities, right? So we talk a lot about just how some of the most frustrating behaviors as parents almost always have some roots in that executive function piece. And for me, I think particularly as believers, like, we don't want our kids to live in sin. And so when we perceive these behaviors as sin, like for instance, for my daughter, for many years, I was like, she's just really selfish. And I've got to punish that in some way, not necessarily even physical punishment, but I've got to make it so that she doesn't keep doing this because God doesn't want us to be selfish. He wants us to be giving. And so for me, it felt very burdensome as a parent of like, I feel like we're making no forward motion. She's just a selfish kid. And it was hard in our relationship because I perceived her in such a way that was very negative. And so as I learned about this and I realized, honestly, there's so much of this having trouble taking a perspective, having trouble being flexible in the moment that makes her look selfish or makes her look like she's only thinking about herself. It really revolutionized not only the way that I engaged with her, but the way I saw her as a human being. And so I think that also, especially as believers, it can be a big weight where we label all of these things as sin. And sure, our kids have sin nature and there's sin roots to a lot of it, but there's also often a lot of skill challenges that we can lean into.
Yeah, you gave that example of, getting ready in the morning or whatever, but and I always teach when I teach for FASD, I break it down as most of the time we parents will say something like go clean your room. You have to clean your room. And then it doesn't happen, and then there's the consequence and the discipline and the lecture and all of that, and it just ends up in a meltdown. Nobody's happy and the room doesn't get clean. So,
Exactly.
and I've had this with some of my kids before, and before I understood, like you said, how many steps are involved in cleaning a room and how much executive function even does it involve.
Yep.
So you have a kiddo who you send in there to clean, and depending on their age, they might not know all of the steps. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of decision making that has to take place to do a task like that. And where do we start? And how do
Yep.
I know when I'm done? And all of those kinds of things. And then I would go in and I would, find a kiddo who is in the middle of, they found, a, I remember my daughter who's now 35, and I didn't know anything about trauma back then because she came in as kinship, and I didn't know anything about prenatal exposure back then. But I would walk in the room a half an hour later and she'd be on the floor in this pile of junk that was still on the floor. And she'd found a book in there. She was an avid
Sure.
reader. And she's reading this book she hadn't seen in 2 weeks. And I'm like, the lecture, right? I was a
Yeah.
lecturing parent,
Yeah.
throwing out all the words that I now
Yes.
know they don't catch most of them. But what you're not listening, you're being disobedient. Now you
Hmm.
can't stay up late tonight after dinner. You have to go to bed early, issuing the consequence. And
Yes.
then there's the meltdown. And it was just terrible. And then
Yeah.
so many years later, as I began to learn this, I realized that poor kid was not being defiant or rebellious or disobedient. She didn't know really what to do. It just
Yeah.
looked like she should, but she really didn't because of the trauma and how it rewired her brain or how it wired
Totally.
her brain and possible prenatal exposure. We don't know for sure there, but it can look, I think that's one of the biggest challenges. It can look like sin, like you said,
Yeah.
and then we're trying to correct and punish and discipline, but yet their brain just can't do it oftentimes.
Hmm.
And
Yep.
for me, it was heartbreaking, but then, pull myself up by my bootstraps and learn so that I can do better, right?
Yeah.
When we learn better, we can do better. But executive function is such a huge one. So I'm so grateful that you are addressing that. You do another one. Well, before we go on to that, because we gave them a lot of this is what it looks like and it's hard and terrible, but those things that can help, and like you mentioned, breaking it down into smaller
Yep.
steps. 6 steps, they're not going to
Yep.
remember all 6 steps. So give us a couple other little tidbits that could help if we have a kiddo who's struggling with executive function.
Particularly with tasks, I like visual schedules. So if you have a younger kid, put a visual schedule up in the bathroom of bedtime routine or the AM routine. I had a friend that always would do one task at a time and then come back. So it was like, go brush your teeth and then come back. Okay, go get your jams on and then come back. So
Yep.
doing it kind of one at a time. Also, just giving your physical presence can really help. So when my daughter was working on the cleaning the room thing, we would break it down, but I would also sit with her until she got going. It was very hard. The task initiation, that's also an executive function thing, and she just had a really hard time getting started. It felt very overwhelming. And so I would go in and sit, or I would start with her and I would say, hey, I'm going to start with you picking up your dirty clothes while you do this like part of the room cleanup. And then I would sneak out and do other things and come back and check. But just our presence, whether, I think about that a lot with homework, like, let's do the first problem together. And then it feels less overwhelming. They can get going. Those frequent check-ins and just that physical presence can really help. With impulse control, I talk a lot about, just practicing. So with games where kids have to take turns, red light, green light, or Uno, things like that, that frustration tolerance can be helpful. And also just trying to help them work on mindfulness of like, what were you thinking right before you did that? And can we work on pausing and thinking, what are the options you actually had there? This is what you did, but what maybe could you have done differently? And we do a lot of role playing in our house, a lot of talking through, what did you do? What could you maybe have done differently? What was the outcome? And that can often help with impulse control, just helping kiddos to practice what they would do differently the next time and getting some of that muscle memory of, okay, when I feel like this, I have choices. Impulse control is one of the hardest things I've found to work on. It's just takes a long time. I also like to teach kids this idea of a wave of emotion. So you're gonna get to the point where you're gonna feel like you're at the very top of the wave and you feel like you have to do this thing or you have to explode into this emotion. But if you wait just a few seconds, it will lessen, it will come down. And so we talk a lot about kind of waiting that the wave of that emotion. And so just getting them to pause, it takes a lot of time and a lot of practice, but some of those things help.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I love that very hands-on, practical approach that families can take. And then another area that you offer training in, which I think is just it's so needed, it's called displacing shame, healing problematic sexual behavior through connection. Tell us
Mhm.
about that.
Yeah, I'm super excited about that. So we're actually launching this week in an online format. We've been doing this training in a live virtual format and a live format for over a year, getting data. And this was just one of those things where I was so frustrated. We had families coming to us just devastated, particularly when one child in their home had harmed another child in their home. There's not much worse as a parent, feeling just that you love this child so much, but you're so angry at what they've done and you feel such failure as a parent. And so my heart was just broken for so many families who did not know where to go, felt so judged by their faith community, by their friends, by their family, by for sure by the system, and just didn't know where to turn for resources. And so when I was trying to walk alongside them, I went and searched and I really didn't find really hardly anything out there for parents. And so we really wanted to provide hope for these families because as I was reviewing the literature, it was so clear to me in the data that these kiddos, these behaviors are learned behaviors, many of them from gaps, from neglect and lack of education about privacy, about body boundaries, paired with some of these impulse control challenges and all the things we've talked about. just, it's a recipe for challenge. And so it was like, well, duh, like we should have seen this coming with all the ways that our kids already have challenges. And then as they go into pre-puberty and into adolescence, we should expect that on some level they might struggle. And so we developed Displacing Shame, and it's basically a 2-part curriculum. There's a 101 that everyone takes to look at what even is normal, what is typical in sexual development, because particularly as a faith community, I think there's a lot of miseducation or lack of education about how God designed us as sexual beings, and that there is some natural exploration and curiosity that might make us uncomfortable, but actually is necessary for kids to learn about their bodies, for us to teach them. So we go into a lot of the basics of what is typical, what is concerning. We look at a lot of myths surrounding problematic sexualized behavior, why it can be so shame-filled, why it feels so isolating for families. And then we really just talk about the hope of the fact that these kiddos can learn new ways of getting their needs met, and they can turn away from problematic sexual behavior. So that's in the 101. And then caregivers, we have a track for caregivers. We have a track for non-clinical staff that are maybe working in, we talked about our mission work, that may be working in a group home setting, or, in another country doing mission work where they have kids living in their home, but they're not parents. And then we also have tracks for leaders of organizations, both social work organizations and faith-based leaders. And that could be for churches, for camps. And so that's kind of like the step 2. Once people take the 101, then they can choose their second track that goes deeper into exactly what do we do? How do we redirect without shame? How do we teach new skills to meet the need that's behind problematic sexualized behavior? Often people don't realize it's actually driven by poor regulation. A kiddo feels anxious and they don't know how to calm themselves. And so they use these behaviors to calm themselves. Maybe it's curiosity that then they have impulse control challenges. And so they get caught up in addiction, or they get curious and they act out without thinking how that impacts the other person. And so there's just so many levels to it that once we really pull back that shame piece and look at it for what it is, a lot of it is skill building. And I find that it helps families feel less fearful because they have some tools and they realize, okay, if we work on these skills, it's really going to help my child to choose different behaviors, and they can have success, and I can keep my family safe. So just super excited. We're launching the 101 on demand this week, and then we hope to have all the deeper dives in an on-demand format by fall.
I think that is so necessary to have that training available to families, because it is, especially when our kids, I mean, we can see some of that stuff in younger children when they've come in, depending on what happened to them prior to coming to us. But also, like with my boys, I have boys, FAS, and then they become teenagers. But they're teenagers biologically, right? They're teenagers, but yet
Chronologic age.
yes, but then, as you know, developmentally, they're on a younger level, right?
Yeah.
So, then I have a kiddo who's kind of like an 8-year-old, but he's in a 16-year-old boy's body. And then you've got the raging hormones and things. And
Yeah.
we just talk about things in our house that I've got 8 kids, right? I've got 8 kids. My youngest two, like I had told you, my youngest one is 19. And I feel like in all my 30 something years of parenting, really, it's been the last 3 years, I have talked about things that I never thought I would really openly talk about around my kitchen table or during the day. And it's like, okay, but we have to, you have to openly talk about those things and be able to walk with them through it and teach constantly, repetition, teaching what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and boundaries with words and touch and all of that kind of thing. And it's constant, because even with the executive function piece alone, remembering that these are the rules, and then controlling the impulse that comes. So it's
Totally.
I highly recommend. I want to sign up for this one too. Like I was talking about, I want to take the executive function one because I teach on that all the time, and I would love to take a course on it. And then this one is definitely another one. So I'm super excited about all of the training that you offer at Chosen. So it's www.chosen.care.
Yes. And when that's the main website, and we'll put this in the show notes, but chosen.care / displacing shame is where you can go to sign up for all the online courses for displacing shame.
Awesome. That is wonderful. Now this episode will air in May. So when does the shame workshop actually take place?
So it's an on-demand course. So the 101 you can purchase, and you have unlimited access. for as long as you want to take to do the course. So it's got a video component, it's got multiple video components, it's got a lot of interactive things, and the deeper dives should be ready by fall to be on demand. I still do them periodically, like in the live virtual format. But by fall, we should have all the deeper dives ready in the LMS and the online on-demand format as well. So people can take those whenever. I found particularly with PSB, there's still just so much insecurity and shame on the part of parents. People don't even want to come to a live virtual training because they're so worried about people finding out that their kid is struggling with this, and they don't want their child to be judged. And so this was the first one that we wanted to put in an on-demand format so that it's not a barrier for people. Time isn't a barrier, and neither is this worry of people finding out that your child is struggling if you're not ready to go there yet. So super excited to have it in that format.
Yeah. Well, we're all in that boat. So I encourage
Yes.
our listeners, don't hold back. Take this training, because if you don't need it yet, you will.
Yes. Yes.
So we'll definitely have links in the show notes, because this is vital training. So let's pivot a little bit. I want to talk about, you chose the verse that I opened with, which was Isaiah 61:1. Let me read that there. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners. Bethany, what does that verse mean to you?
To me, it means that I grew up with so much privilege, and I had an intact family, and we had socioeconomic means, and I was on a trajectory to just have a pretty easy, insulated life. And the Lord put a calling on my heart to say yes to foster care and adoption and trauma, knowing that I had no idea what I was saying yes to and probably would have never signed up for it on my own. And it has taken me on a course, exactly what that verse says, of just being a part of a work that is so challenging and so hard and so heartbreaking in so many levels. But it's being willing, it's willingly choosing the harder road so that others can come to know him, so that people can have freedom, so that children can feel the love of a family. And I've just been so blessed by the fact that the Lord called me into this work, and I want to be a part of that for the rest of my life, and to bring others into that as well, to say, it isn't the easiest road, but the Lord has called us to be a part of bringing his kingdom here on earth. And foster care and adoption is one of, in my opinion, the very best ways to put yourself right up next to people that need exactly the kind of emotional, physical, spiritual resources that you have been gifted, not just to benefit, but to share with others.
Oh, I love that. Love that. Thank you so much for that. And we talked earlier, our listeners are primarily adoptive, foster parents, kinship caregivers. So as we wrap up, Bethany, would you share some words of encouragement for our audience?
Yeah, it all changes. I don't know that it ever gets easier, but it's always something new and different. And so I always just remind myself it's a stage. Right now we have two, one pre-adolescent who thinks she's grown and another, teenage boy. And it has its really fun stuff, and it has its days where you're like, I don't know if I can exist with this human in this house much longer, right? It's like the hormones and the attitude and the disrespect is so high. And I just remind myself, it's a stage, and there'll be a different stage. I think about my adult kiddos and what they're going through, and being a grandma and watching them. One of my sons is about to get married, and it has its own challenges as well, and things that are heartbreaking about it. But I think when they're that stage, I'm going to miss this sassy teenager, and, all the reminders and the training that's going on, and it goes quickly. So I would just encourage you, find people, because it is hard. Find people that you can be honest with and that you can share, hey, today I am really struggling. Because like you and I talked about, I do this for a living and I mess up all the time. I have to ask my kids for forgiveness all the time, because we're just still struggling to honor God day in and day out in life, right? So that would just be my encouragement, is remember that everything changes, everything is a season, and find your people, because being able to be honest is one of the best things that helps us to continue to show up in a regulated, loving way for our kiddos, because we have somebody that can listen to us, and going to the Lord with those things of trusting him, of like, Lord, I saw something today on social media. It said, it's not your job to feed the 5,000. It's just your job to show up with the fish and loaves. And I think, man, that hits home for me, of like, it is just my job to show up with my imperfect parenting skills and what God has taught me. And he covers over so many things and blesses in spite of sometimes my meager offerings, but that's how he works.
That's how he works. He gets the glory that way
He
too, right?
does. Yes.
Oh, well, Bethany, thank you so much. Thank you for all that you're doing on behalf of the adoption and foster care community. I love the fact that this training is out there and available. And I encourage our listeners to go check that out. And thank you for being on the show today and sharing those encouraging words.
Thank you for all you're doing to encourage foster and adoptive and kinship families and for having me on. Appreciate it.
And thank you for listening to this episode of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey. I hope that you were encouraged and inspired by my conversation with Bethany Hall from Chosen. And I hope you'll check out their website. Again, there's links in the show notes because they just offer top-notch training that I hope that you will check out on their website, which I believe is www.chosen.care. But there's links to the actual trainings if you check out the show notes. So what an encouraging, for me, it was encouraging just to hear about the amazing training that is out there and available to everybody in the adoption and foster care community. So make sure that you're checking that out because we want to encourage you and equip you on this show. And that is also why I offer the training that I do focusing on FASD. You heard about our Hope for the FASD Journey online support community in the commercial, but I also offer coaching for one-on-one if you want to talk and learn more on a one-on-one basis about FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. But I also offer online and in-person training as well. So every month I offer a free intro to FASD. It's 1 hour. It's 1 hour. It's online. And it's an introductory workshop using the Facets neurobehavioral approach to explore the impact of prenatal exposure to alcohol on the brain and body. I go over the primary, secondary, and tertiary characteristics and symptoms of FASD and begin to unpack accommodations and strengths-based strategies for parents and caregivers and professionals. So it's just 1 hour. So we're just sort of, scratching the surface on that, but it's free and it's a great workshop and resource for everybody. But I do a 3-hour deep dive. So it's kind of the same information. We just go deeper. We get to unpack more and start looking at accommodations and how we can support and really building our toolbox of strategies to help our kids who have brain differences like FASD. So to find any of the workshops, to register for any of them, learn more about the support group, you would go to our website, which is justicefororphansny.org, and you'll learn all about that there. And I also do blog for adoptive and foster parents on my personal blog at sandraflack.com. It sounds like I'm sending you to a lot of places, and we are working on in the near future kind of bringing everything together under the umbrella of the adoption and foster care journey. But stay tuned. You can always find me on social media. You can always email me. My email is in the show notes for this episode, but you can find me at justicefororphans@sandraflack.com and at the adoption and foster care journey. So we're going to make it easier for you eventually, but we're learning as we are growing. So check all of that out. Also, we do have a YouTube channel at Justice for Orphans, and all of the video versions of this podcast are there. So, but you'd have to go to the Justice for Orphans YouTube channel if you would want to watch the video. Make sure, again, to find and follow us on social media. We are now on Facebook at the Adoption and Foster Care Journey, and we are on Instagram at AFC_journey. Hope you'll check it out. And I am grateful that you spent your valuable time with me today. I am thrilled to have you along for the journey.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast, brought to you by Justice for Orphans. We hope you were encouraged today. Please be sure to subscribe to this podcast and leave a review, and share it with your fellow foster and adoptive parent friends so they can be encouraged too. Be sure to find and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Justice for Orphans, and check out our website for vital resources at justicefororphansny.org.